My dad secretly changed his will 2 weeks before he died and left everything to my uncle. When I found out why, I wished I'd never asked. My father was not a perfect man. I think I knew that before I was old enough to name it. He worked long hours at a sheet metal fabrication plant in Akron, Ohio, came home smelling of iron and machine oil, ate dinner mostly in silence, and fell asleep watching the news before 9 o'clock. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't absent in the obvious ways. He showed up to my baseball games, sat in the wooden bleachers with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and on the rare occasions I did something worth noticing, a good hit, a clean catch, he'd give me a single nod that felt, at the time, like a standing ovation. That was my father. Economical with everything, especially warmth. When he was diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic cancer in March, it moved fast the way that particular disease always does. By October, he was on hospice. By the second week of November, he was gone. I was 34 years old, and I stood at his graveside in a cemetery outside Akron on a gray Tuesday morning, feeling a grief I couldn't entirely explain. Not just for the man I'd lost, but for the conversation we never quite managed to have. I have one sibling. My sister Renata is 3 years younger than me. We are close in the way that two people who survived the same difficult childhood can be close. Not always openly affectionate, but fundamentally loyal. We grieved together, we handled the arrangements together, and together, about 3 weeks after the funeral, we sat down with my father's attorney, a quiet, bespectacled man named Gerald, who had a habit of folding and unfolding the same piece of paper while he talked, to hear the reading of the will. My father's estate wasn't enormous, but it wasn't nothing. The house in Akron, paid off, worth around $240,000, a savings account with roughly $60,000 in it, some tools, the truck, a coin collection he'd been quietly assembling since the 1970s that turned out to be worth more than any of us realized, close to $30,000. All told, somewhere around $330,000 of accumulated, careful, working-class thrift. Gerald cleared his throat, unfolded the paper for the 4th time, and told us that the entirety of my father's estate had been left to his younger brother, my Uncle Roy. I remember Renata going very still beside me. I remember the sound of the heating vent in Gerald's office. I remember thinking with bizarre calm that I must have misheard. I had misheard. Gerald explained that a new will had been filed 11 days before my father's death, superseding a previous will in which Renata and I had been named as equal beneficiaries. The new document was legally sound. It had been signed and witnessed while my father was, according to Gerald's careful phrasing, of sound mind and body, within the legal definition applicable. We laughed without speaking. Renata cried in the car. I didn't. I drove us home to her apartment and sat at her kitchen table for a long time, trying to construct a version of events that made sense. My Uncle Roy was 61 years old. He lived alone in a rural Pennsylvania, had been divorced twice, and my father's relationship with him had always struck me as cordial but not especially warm. They saw each other at holidays, they called on birthdays, they were brothers in the perfunctory way, present without being close, connected without being intimate. At least, that's what I'd always believed. I called Roy 3 days later. He answered on the second ring, and the moment I said my name, he exhaled, a long, slow breath that sounded like something he'd been holding for weeks. I asked him directly, did he know about the will? He said yes. I asked him why. I told him I wasn't calling to threaten or contest. I told him, and I meant it, that I just needed to understand, that my father had been a man of few explanations, and dying without giving us this one felt to me like a wound I couldn't start to treat without first knowing its shape. Roy was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your father didn't leave you that money because he was ashamed of himself, and he didn't want you spending the rest of your life benefiting from something he couldn't bring himself to tell you." I asked him what he meant. What followed was 40 minutes that rearranged the architecture of my entire childhood. My father, Roy told me, had not always been the quiet, careful man I knew. In his 20s, before he married my mother, before Renata and I existed, he had been involved with a woman in Columbus named Deborah. They were together for 2 years. Deborah had become pregnant. My father, 23 years old, terrified, and in Roy's careful phrasing, not the man he would eventually try to become, had pressured her in ways Roy described as sustained and emotionally coercive to end the pregnancy. She hadn't wanted to. She wanted to keep the baby. My father had been relentless. Financial threats, emotional withdrawal, isolation from the social circle they shared, until she finally agreed. Deborah had a breakdown afterward. She left Columbus. My father never saw her again. He carried it, Roy said, like certain men carry things, by burying it so deep that it eventually starts to poison the soil above it. My father had told Roy about it in 1987, in the kitchen of Roy's first house, drunk on bad whiskey and crying in a way Roy said he had never seen before or after. Roy had held it in confidence for 37 years. In the last weeks of his life, my father had told Roy he couldn't leave his money to his children, couldn't leave anything to the family he'd built, without first making some accounting for the family he'd destroyed. Deborah, it turned out, had died in 2019, but she had raised another child, a daughter from a later relationship who was now struggling. My father had given Roy the money with explicit instructions: find that daughter, find whatever of Deborah's family remained, and do something useful. Roy had already been in contact with Deborah's daughter. Her name was Cassandra. She was 27, had 2 kids, and was working 2 jobs in Pittsburgh. I sat with this for a long time, weeks, honestly. I moved through stages that felt nothing like the clean textbook model, not denial and acceptance in any orderly sequence, but something messier. Anger, yes. Not at Deborah or Cassandra, never that. Anger at my father for the act itself, for the years of silence, for the cowardice of addressing it only at death's door when there was no one left to really reckon with. Anger, too, at the specific shape of his solution, noble on the surface, but also, I couldn't help feeling, another act of unilateral control. He decided. He hadn't asked. And underneath the anger, something harder to name, a kind of sorrowful recognition. Because the man Roy described, young, frightened, capable of cruelty dressed up as pragmatism, was not unrecognizable to me. I had seen traces of that man. Not in any act so serious, but in the way my father could be hard and closed when he was afraid, the way he solves problems by eliminating their visibility rather than their cause. I had inherited some of that. I'd had to work as an adult to unlearn it. Renata took it differently. She went cold and quiet in a way that frightened me. She didn't cry when I told her. She just said very softly, "He never once considered telling us himself." And then she went and stood at her kitchen window for a long time, looking at the parking lot. She wasn't wrong. That was the thing I kept coming back to. Whatever moral logic my father had constructed for his decision, and I believe it was real. I believe he genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. It was still, at its core, one more instance of my father making decisions for everyone around him without their input. He controlled Deborah. He controlled the narrative for 30-odd years. And at the very end, he controlled this too, the size and shape of his own reckoning executed posthumously on his own terms, with everyone else simply receiving the consequences. I have not contested the will. I made that decision early, and I've held to it. Not because I think my father's choice was entirely just to Renata and me, but because Cassandra and her children have nothing to do with any of this. They didn't ask for any of it either. I did reach out to Roy and asked if I could write Cassandra a letter. Nothing demanding, nothing that would make her feel claimed or obligated, just an introduction. Roy passed it along. She wrote back, short, cautious, polite. She said she appreciated knowing. She said she didn't know what it meant yet. I told her I didn't either. My mother, from whom my father had been divorced for over a decade before he died, listened to all of this on the phone and then was quiet for a moment before saying, He was a man with a very heavy conscience and not enough courage to carry it in the open. That was the tragedy of him. I've thought about that sentence almost every day since. I don't know what I feel about my father now. The simple grief I expected has become something more complicated, a kind of layered accounting in which I try to hold simultaneously the man who nodded once from bleachers and meant the world by it, and the man who spent decades managing a wrong instead of naming it. They are both real. Neither cancels the other. What I know is this. He left us no money, but he left us something. He left us the truth finally, in the only way he apparently knew how to deliver it. Sideways, posthumously, wrapped in a legal document, filtered through a brother who'd been holding the secret for longer than I'd been fully alive. It's not the inheritance I expected. I'm still deciding what to do with it.